Welcome, guys. We've had the sprint race and the qualifying for Sunday's Grand Prix. Let's talk Saturday at the Dutch Grand Prix, Zandvoort. George Russell won the sprint race. Lando Norris has taken the Grand Prix pole position. Charles Leclerc somehow made a soft tyre work better than the McLarens did a medium. Max Verstappen will start his home Grand Prix from 7th, and I think there's a much bigger story underneath all of that, because Saturday at Zandvoort has given us a really strange situation. I don't think the car that's produced the fastest qualifying lap is necessarily the car I choose for the Grand Prix. And you can let me know your thoughts in the comments on that one. Mercedes, McLaren and Ferrari appear to producing their performance in completely different ways. And if what we saw in sprint carries over to Sunday, Norris might actually be more vulnerable from pole than you think. So let's take a look at what we actually learned and go through Saturday. Let's get to it. Welcome, guys. If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. And if you enjoy the video, hit the like. Let's talk Zandvoort. And so far, George Russell has probably been the best driver of the weekend. And we'll start with him. Sprint pole, sprint victory, led all 24 laps. And he's missed out on pole position by a 1/10 of a second. And that's a pretty outstanding Saturday considering where he's been. He's been off the pace all season and he's bounced back. And I think what's impressed me most, he didn't spend the sprint race desperately trying to disappear up the road. He just managed his tyres throughout the sprint race. High speed corners he was just managing because he expected Norris to attack later in the race. And just think about that, when you're leading, the temptation is just to use the clear air and just push like crazy and build a gap. Russell did quite the opposite. He protected his tyres, and so if Norris did come at him late, he'd still have the performance available. It actually wasn't Norris, it was Charles Leclerc that would be his main threat. Because, Norris never got the opportunity to do that, nor did Charles Leclerc. Russell eventually won by just a second and a half or less. And it tells me that Mercedes probably hasn't got the qualifying speed. It's a car that George Russell can manage, and over 72 laps tomorrow, I think that could actually be more important. I think the phrase I'd use here is the operating window, and the outright fastest car isn't always the best race car. And if Mercedes can get its tyres working across a wide range of temperatures and more than the McLaren, Russell doesn't need a car that can be fast everywhere. He just needs it to be more consistent, and right now it looks incredibly consistent. And he's done a pretty solid job. Next up, you've got to talk Charles Leclerc, and I think, has he just given away Ferrari's secret weapon for Sunday? I think my biggest takeaway from the sprint wasn't actually George Russell, it was Charles Leclerc, because Charles started on the soft tyre and everyone around him chose the mediums, and he did say at the end of the race he'd either look like a hero or look stupid. And thankfully it's we generally know how that story ends. You generally look a little bit silly, but the soft gives you the performance early doors. That's just the way it falls. And then it drops off as the race goes on. Except Charles' race basically went backwards to that story, but didn't get away particularly well. He wasn't quick at the start, but the longer the sprint went on, the stronger he became. And on lap 18, he got a brilliant move on Lando Norris down into turn 1 under the brakes. He said he had to get that move done. And if you think about that tyre comparison, Norris was driving a McLaren on the mediums, Charles Leclerc was driving a Ferrari on a soft. And he'd already completed most of the sprint race, and it was Norris who looked vulnerable. Charles Leclerc himself said Ferrari's homework on the soft tyres paid off, and that's massive information for Sunday, because this might not simply mean the soft tyre is surprisingly good. I think it just means that Ferrari is controlling tyre temperature better than the McLaren, and that's an important difference between degradation and overheating. A tyre can have plenty of rubber remaining and still lose performance because its temperature has moved out of its ideal operating window. And if that's what's happening at McLaren, simply putting a harder tyre on isn't going to make that automatically go away. The problem's still going to be there. And suddenly Ferrari starting 5th and 6th doesn't look quite as bad as it did probably immediately after qualifying if you're a Ferrari fan, because Charles might have, he might have given Ferrari a tyre management weapon nobody kind of expected. So watch out for that come race day. McLaren's weekend doesn't make sense really until you take a closer look, and we'll bring up McLaren next because their Saturday is a bizarre one, isn't it? In the sprint, Norris effectively said they were just slow. In the race, it wasn't down to the tyres, his losing a position to Charles Leclerc, and then a few hours later he's put the car on pole position. So how can it be too slow at 11 o'clock in the morning and then the fastest F1 car like 3 hours later? I think the answer to that is we're looking at two completely different tyre types of performances here. I think McLaren's appear extremely strong at Zandvoort in the fast corners. Norris himself highlighted that, but the car hasn't looked as convincing through the slower corner sections, and that's another factor here. Qualifying is about extracting everything from the tyres for one lap. The race is about keeping the tyre alive for a dozen laps, and they aren't the same challenge. My theory here is probably that McLaren might have the highest performing ceiling this weekend, but without having the best average performance. And I think there's an important distinction. Norris can extract that enormous peak for one qualifying lap, but it's Russell in the Mercedes and what Ferrari we may have been able to see that can maintain a greater percentage of its ultimate performance for longer. And if that's true, tomorrow can be, I think it'd be really fascinating to see how we get on, because Norris's track position, Russell and Charles behind might have the better race tools. We've got Kimi Antonelli in the mix there as well. But I think you still got to give Lando Norris a huge amount of credit, because none of this should take away from his lap here. The margins in Q3 were ridiculous. Norris an 11.1, Russell a 10th behind, Antonelli 1.13 behind, Oscar 0.14 behind. So the four cars were separated by less than 1,500, so basically nothing. And with the threat of rain arriving, Norris had to produce it when it mattered, and that's now back-to-back Grand Prix pole positions for him, and that's something Norris is getting pretty good at, not necessarily being the fastest for every minute of qualifying, but being fastest during the minute that actually counts, and that's the big difference. We'll jump next on to Kimi Antonelli, and I think he's been doing probably what a championship leader should do. He was the fastest on Friday practice, 4th in the sprint, but then got the third. He's third for qualifying as well, and he's barely one of the main stories this weekend, but that's probably actually a compliment considering he's not been great, but because this is what a championship driver or driving looks like at times. You don't have to win every session. You don't have to dominate every weekend. You need to put the car near the front. Antonelli even came to sprint qualifying compromised after his FP1 excursion or SQ1 excursion, but by Grand Prix qualifying, he's just 0.031 behind his teammate George Russell. Tomorrow, he's directly behind Norris. He's got his teammate alongside him. If Russell attacks Norris, how aggressive does Kimi Antonelli need to be? Because Kimi isn't just driving to win a Dutch Grand Prix. He's trying to win a world championship. But knowing Kimi, I think he'll give it everything, and he has got, interestingly enough, or will take a engine penalty in Monza. So he probably wants to try and get a good result here because he knows it's going to be a tough one for his home Grand Prix next. We'll go more into that at the preview for Monza. But we'll talk about Max Verstappen next. And I think that his results are two ways you can look at it. Max Verstappen 7th at Zandvoort. It's almost difficult to process, but I think the interesting thing here is if you look at Liam Lawson, and Lawson thrown back into the Red Bull at the last minute, very little preparation, a sprint weekend, one practice session, and he's qualified 8th, just 0.1 behind Max Verstappen. And he's saying that's incredible from Lawson. I think it probably is. But I think it tells you from Max's point of view, he's normally one of the best qualifiers in F1, and at his home circuit he can only put the car 7th, and the other Red Bull is 8th. Maybe 7th is probably just where this car belongs, and that's why his teammate comparison is probably important here. When drivers finish next to each other, it probably doesn't always tell you how well they've driven. I think the better question is, where should this car have finished? And with them both, Liam and Max side by side, I think they've probably both extracted probably close to the maximum available. The Red Bull isn't a front-running car this weekend in Zandvoort. They look difficult to drive on the front end, and you need that around the tight and twisty circuit of Zandvoort. So it's been a difficult one to judge from Max Verstappen. Probably not the homecoming he wished. Liam Lawson, I think, could be the underrated story of Saturday, probably alongside Yuki Tsunoda. I don't think I've given him underrated him though, but I think Liam himself, you got to say he deserves a lot of credit. 11th in sprint qualifying, 8th in the Grand Prix qualifying session, just a 10th away from Max Verstappen. I think that's seriously impressive, because switching cars is not just like jumping in any other road car. You've got different brake characteristics, steering weight, differential behavior, deployment behavior, aero balance. And Liam touched on this in the interviews post-qualifying, and he said it's very, very different to the car he's driven. And he's had basically just one proper practice session to relearn everything. And to get that car into Q3, I think he's done a pretty respectable job. But I think that also speaks of how great a job Yuki Tsunoda's done. He's never driven these cars, and he was right in the mix. And you can probably beg the question of, why didn't Yuki get the chance in the top Red Bull if it was going to be a whole different story for Liam Lawson, if he's going to have to do all this relearning? Yuki was in the same position as him, jumping into a new car, and so therefore you basically compromised both drivers rather than just one. Liam having to relearn everything in the top team, and Yuki having to relearn everything for his first run in a 2026 car. What is the big gain here for Red Bull? Is it just a comparison to see where Liam is at in this car alongside Max Verstappen, and a 10th back is pretty good? And is it just to see where Yuki is also at alongside Arvid Lindblad? And I think Arvid's outqualified Yuki, but Yuki's kept him pretty honest. So we'll see how that pans out in the race tomorrow. The sprint, well, let's not pretend it was a classic, the sprint race. It wasn't, but the lack of overtaking actually gave us some important information. Track position is going to be a big factor tomorrow. It's enormous around here. Zandvoort's narrow. The corners flow into each other without any hard braking zones, and following another car hurts your front end, and the overtaking opportunities are pretty limited. And that means Norris's pole position is worth even more here than it probably would be in somewhere like Spa. But it also means strategy becomes really important. The undercut, will that play a big factor? We've seen tyre deg is not quite as high, so the overcut might be the stronger way to go. We'll see that. Tyre offsets, extending a stint, safety cars, and potentially the weather, which baited us, didn't it? At the end of the sprint came, 30 seconds too late to just throw a wild one into the final lap of the race. You might not beat someone by passing them here this weekend. I think it's going to be strategy. You might have to beat them without ever racing them wheel to wheel. And we'll see how that pans out for Sunday. So after Saturday, here's how I see it. McLaren has the peak performance. Mercedes probably have the most complete car. And Ferrari might have the most interesting tyre behaviour of the three. And that's three completely different ways of producing a lap time. And probably that's why I don't think tomorrow is going to be a simple race. Yes, Lando Norris does some pole position. Therefore, Norris, you can say, is the favourite, but I just don't see it that way. Russell showed in the sprint that Mercedes has genuine long-run performance. Charles Leclerc showed Ferrari can make an aggressive try strategy work far longer than expected. But the difference here is we didn't quite see the big performance difference in the softs as compared to the mediums. The lap times were fairly similar. Or is that just the fact that with Charles stuck in dirty air, we didn't quite get to see the strong pace of that? We'll find out for tomorrow. And we've seen that Norris showed that McLaren can produce devastating one-lap speed. So here's a question I'd like to ask you. If you can choose a car for tomorrow, but you couldn't choose your starting position, would you take the McLaren, the Ferrari, or the Mercedes? Because after everything we've saw today, I think I'd like to take the Mercedes. If Russell isn't sitting underneath Norris's rear wing after the opening stint tomorrow, the race could become very interesting indeed. And we've got the Ferraris to watch out for and what they can do. We've got the battle between the two teammates, Kimi Antonelli, George Russell, to watch out, something that we've not seen, since Canada. So that's going to be really interesting to see there. But yeah, there we have it. That is the breakdown for Saturday sprint race and qualifying. And I'll see you after the race as well for the review. Join me for the watch along as well. I'll be live just 10 minutes before race and lights out. Join me then. If you enjoy the video, please hit the thumbs up button. And if you're new, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.